Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Adaptations Without Delay presentation with Rachel Russell, one of the authors, a guide to planning and delivering home adaptations differently. Just so you're aware, this is going live on Facebook, sorry, as well. So if you do want a copy of the recording or to discuss or share with everybody, just pop onto the Occupational Therapy Adaptations Facebook page, not the group, the page. We will share the link across the Promoting Independence and the OTAC page. Just so you're aware, if you've got any technical problems, like I said, it is going out on Facebook as well, and it will stay on Facebook for a while, so you'll be able to watch it back. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you across to Rachel Russell for today's presentation.
Thanks very much, Stuart, and thank you, OTAC, for inviting me along and talking about something that I'm absolutely passionate about, which is adaptations without delay. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn off my camera because it tends to eat up my bandwidth. So I just thought you'd have a look at my face now and have a look at my little office, and then I'll just turn my camera off. Okay. So what I want to do over the next half hour is just take you through the publication Adaptations Without Delay. I want to give you a little bit of insight into how we developed the publication, and then kind of hold your hand as we take you through the different elements of the publication as well. Just for those of you, just to provide a little bit of history. So Adaptations Without Delay was published last year in June, and it is, I guess it's the sequel to Minor Adaptations Without Delay. Now, Minor Adaptations Without Delay was published in 2006, and that was a document that RCOT published as I say, 2006 now, a long time ago. And at that time, it was looking, the reason that they published Minor Adaptations Without Delay was to look at ways in which housing associations could do some of the more minor adaptations rather than having their tenants sit on OT waiting lists. So about 4 years ago, RCOT decided that, obviously because of the age of the document, they wanted to have a look at whether there was still need for such a publication, and if there was, did it need updating? So I was part of a team with the Housing Lane that was successful in being part of that team that had a look at Minor Adaptations Without Delay, and as I say, last year we published the updated version. I think it's quite timely because obviously at the time when we published Adaptations Without Delay, obviously nobody had heard of COVID-19. But what I'm hoping as I go through the presentation, what I want you to have in mind is COVID-19. Lots of you out there will be doing things very differently to what you were doing back in February of this year and before March, before we went into lockdown. And actually, I think it's quite exciting. I think some of those changes will improve the delivery of adaptation services. It's getting us to think differently. And I think what's really good about Adaptations Without Delay as a publication, if you are doing things differently, I think it's a good starting point around how can we do things differently. Is what we're doing appropriate? Is what we're doing evidence-based? So if you've got any questions at the end regarding Adaptations Without Delay and COVID-19, then please do ask. Also, if you've got any questions as I go through, if you put them in the chat box, and then Stuart's going to keep an eye on those for me. So the reason I think that, well, I passionately believe that Adaptations Without Delay has got a real kind of link with some of the things that you're having to do out there in practice because of COVID-19 is because one of the reasons that the whole purpose behind the document, the whole purpose behind the publication is that it's about providing a much more responsive service to those who need adaptations to improve their health and well-being. obviously with COVID-19, the way that we're responsive looks very different to how it did pre-lockdown. So I think that the publication really supports that way of how we can be more responsive, and it's a document that encourages new ways of working, which we're having to do through COVID-19. Many of you will be experienced as we're coming out of lockdown, increasing wait lists, as we've had to, as people with low priorities have had to wait for assessments. So over the next few months, as we come out of lockdown, there's going to be even more of a demand for your skills and knowledge as occupational therapists. So it's about actually, how do we reduce the demands for occupational therapy? How do we make the best use of us as a resource? It's about, obviously, one of the big drivers was obviously trying to look at how we can provide more efficient adaptation services, particularly given the amount of investment that government has made around the and I apologise for any of our colleagues in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, but certainly around in terms of England, in terms of the uplift in the DFG. But once again, we're in COVID-19, we're coming out of lockdown, we need to look at more efficient ways of working. And again, I think the document Adaptations Without Delay is a real good starting point. One of the things I'm sure that you're being asked to do, or being asked to think about through COVID-19, is actually, you know, where is an occupational therapist needed? When are those, what type of cases needs an occupational therapist? And again, the heart of the document really explores that and unpacks that. One of the things that we've tried to do with the document as well is really promote and give voice to what we do as occupational therapists in this field of practice. One of the bugbears that I have, I'm for those of that don't know me, I am an academic as well as an occupational therapist, and one of the bugbears I have is that often I hear practitioners, students talking about what we do in housing and social care as the bread and butter of occupational therapists, and I think that really undermines and undervalues the actual role that we have in social care, and really underplays the complexity of our clinical reasoning and our professional reasoning that we use when we're looking at our assessments and providing solutions. So one of the key things is that it's about making best use of our expertise and really having that understanding around actually occupational therapy in this field of practice is quite complex. One of the key features with the document as well, Minor Adaptations Without Delay had a very England-centric focus, and one of the things that the Royal College wanted to ensure was that any new publication played to the four nations of the UK. So that's a little bit about the purpose of the document. What we hope is that in terms of the content, I think Stuart provided a link to the publication, and I'm going to just put my video back on. So this is the publication. What we hope is that it's a fresh approach to responding to the growing demand for both adaptations as well as occupational therapy in adult health and social care and children's services. It's about recognising that actually adaptations is just a small part of what we do in housing and social care. I think often we're seen it as the equipment and adaptations people, but I think all of you out there who are occupational therapists will recognise that that actually is only one small part of what you do, and is only one type of intervention that you can offer when you work in this field of practice. So that's what we're hoping to do. That's what we want from this document. We really wanted it to be a fresh approach around how we respond as occupational therapists to the growing demand for our skills and knowledge in adult health and social care. And I think what one of the other hats I wear a lot of hats, is that I'm the research and education lead for the specialist section at ARCOT for housing, and it's a great role to have because since COVID-19, I've been able to kind of hear of all the innovative, fresh approaches that practitioners are using out there in practice. And again, I really hope that Adaptations Without Delay will be kind of a useful document as for those of you that are looking at different ways of working. As a document, one of the things that we really want to put across is that this wasn't just 4 or 5 people sat in a room coming up with the content of the document, that we had a lot of stakeholder involvement, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the moment in a minute. One of the great things that we've done in the document is that we've provided a different way of defining and describing adaptations. So rather than looking at thinking about adaptations in terms of type and cost, we've actually thought about complexity, the person's situation. And again, I'll unpack that for you. Within the document, we've provided a framework that helps to look at, okay, if we're going to work differently, if we're going to provide a much more proportionate response to the way that we deliver adaptations, you know, how can we do that? And we've hopefully developed a framework that provides that proportionate way of providing services. Alongside the framework, we've also recognised that when people want to work differently, they want to have an understanding of what some of the strategic and operational considerations that we need to think about, what kind of things do we need to think about in terms of the workforce. So within the document, there are tools to help look at actually, if we're going to work differently, what does the workforce need to look like? What are the other operational considerations we need to think about? Again, and as I've mentioned, and I'll keep mentioning, what's really important for us, the authors, was really valuing the role of occupational therapy, particularly in those really complex situations. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. We've wanted to demonstrate how other staff can perhaps be involved in the assessment and delivery of adaptations. And again, we've explored that in the document. I think one thing that we want to say as well is that a lot of this isn't new. A lot of what we've developed has been based on some really innovative work that happens around the UK already, from Northern Ireland, stuff that happens in Wales, England. So what we've done is there's various case studies within the publication that helps kind of unpack and show actually how people have provided and taken on some of the kind of key messages from the document and are doing things differently. One of the big debates that we had was around design guidance. One of the lovely things about minor adaptations without delay was that it was in 2 parts. The second part of the document was a design guidance. We took a deliberate decision not to go down that route, mainly because we're 4 nations, housing standards, design standards differentiate across the 4 nations, and we felt that actually what we wanted to do was actually signpost rather than say this is how adaptations need to be designed. So there's lots of again signposting to design guidance. So just moving on. Okay, just in terms of the document isn't just for occupational therapists. What we've tried to do is just recognise that we need to give a voice of what we do in terms of the adaptation process to the many other professionals involved in the adaptations process. I think for me, I think this field of practice is really interesting because we are working with colleagues who don't necessarily sit within health and social care. So we're working with colleagues that perhaps don't have that background in health and social care. And I think it's about recognising that we at times speak a different language. So what we wanted to do with the document was really to provide an understanding of what it is that we do as occupational therapists in this field of practice. So we hope the document has a different role and is of interest to different audience. And this slide here just kind of goes through when we were writing the document who we had in mind. So not just only occupational therapists, but our housing colleagues, local authority colleagues, people involved in training, handy person schemes, those involved in commissioning, retailers, because over the next few years, retailers are going to play a more and more important role in providing adaptations. So we've thought quite broad in terms of who we want this document to be of interest to. Just really quickly, I don't want to bore you to death, although I am an academic, so I'm highly trained to send you all to sleep very quickly. But I just wanted to just remind you that, as I say, it wasn't just 4 of us sat together writing this document, that there was UK-wide stakeholder consultation, and that consultation involved stakeholder interviews with occupational therapy managers, home improvement agencies, care and repair agencies across England and Wales, their equivalent in Scotland and Northern Ireland. We spoke to housing providers. We spoke to various RCOT representatives, again, across the 4 nations. We also did an online survey, again, that was UK-wide, and we were overwhelmed. And just so if you did get involved in the survey, huge thank you. But we had about over 800 respondents to the survey, both from occupational therapists, but also the other key key stakeholders in the adaptations process. So staff working in home improvement agencies, housing associations, technicians and trusted assessors. We also did some focus groups across the 4 nations. So as we were bringing the content together, we brought what we were proposing to publish to focus groups across the 4 nations. Underpinning that was a very experienced steering group, and they kind of guided us on our journey as we were putting the new document together. So I just wanted to put that out there so that you've got an understanding of how we kind of brought it together. When we were doing the stakeholder consultation, there were some key findings, and I want to go through this because it will just help you understand again how the document has been shaped in the way that it has. So one of the key themes in terms of how things have changed since minor adaptations was published was this real policy drive now that we look at adaptations as providing a real preventative approach to reducing health and social care needs. So it's about actually how do we look at providing adaptations before people have issues? How can we provide adaptations that help prevent people developing health and social care needs? So that was one of the things that had changed. There was still a sense that there are waits, obviously through COVID-19, this has probably been exacerbated, around waiting for assessments from occupational therapists within social care, and that there was a sense that was contributing to delays. One of the things that the Royal College is really keen to emphasise is recognising that it's not an occupational therapy waiting list, that it is actually social care responsibility, and it's a social care waiting list. So I think that's something that we really need to embrace, because I think sometimes we occupational therapists feel that they're taking a lot of responsibility, but actually many occupational therapists are part of that social care system, and often it's the system within social care, not occupational therapy. One of the key things that came through as well in terms of what people were trying to do out there, but also in terms of what the research is saying, was actually when we have an integrated approach to the assessment, design and installation of adaptations that are delivered around person-centred outcomes, that provides much better outcomes for those individuals who need adaptations. One of the things that came through was this sense that people were really keen when we were doing the interviews and through the survey, that people really wanted to work really differently, but because of the way of the DFG legislation, the way that legislation has been interpreted, was this sense that there was some really relatively simple major adaptations, such as showers, stair lifts and ramps, where the situation was fairly simple and straightforward. And actually, did you need an occupational therapist? But again, that people wanting work differently, but wasn't anything out there that would actually help people to think, right, okay, if we're going to work differently, how can we do that? How can we look at the workforce needs? How can we do things differently from an operational point of view? Again, this idea that when we were looking at adaptations and how people defined minor and major, it was defined around type and cost, and that was, and as we'll explore in the next few slides, that was really impacting on people working differently. And this thing around, actually, there's a lot of people that don't want to go through the social services system, don't want to go through DFGs or the other ways in which adaptations are funded, want to do it themselves, but actually it's about where is really good advice in terms of you know, how to get the best design of it in terms of an adaptation. So there was a sense that there's a whole cohort of people that occupational therapists don't ever touch, but perhaps need advice in terms of designing adaptations that currently we're missing. So just to talk a little bit around the content now. So I don't know if you've got the document open in front of you, but one of the things that we've done is we've provided a different way of describing adaptations. So we've moved away from describing adaptations based on cost and type, and focused on actually looking at complexity. And the way that we've looked at complexity is, again, what we've done is we've used the evidence base. So we've used work by Liz Ainsworth and Desley de Jong, who are occupational therapists, researchers and practitioners in Australia. So we've used their work to provide this definition of simple and complex. And underpinning it is it's about being person-centered. It's by defining adaptations around the complexity of the situation. It allows us to begin to provide a proportionate response, because it's not just based on cost, it's actually based on somebody's needs. Again, the approach prioritizes prevention, and again it highlights actually the complexity of our role and actually where we add value, because as occupational therapists we add value for those cases that are really complex, that benefit from our professional reasoning. Person-centred care, as I say, myself and Marnie were the two occupational therapists that were the authors on this document, and really underpinning all elements of our thinking was around person-centred care. And we just thought it'd be useful just to remind you around what National Voice is, and the whole message around and branding around person-centred care is about. And it's about people just want services to understand what their needs are. They want to have control over the services they get. They want to have control, and the evidence bears out this on the bits of research that's been done in housing adaptations, that people actually want to be involved in, really involved, meaningfully involved in their adaptation. I mean, you imagine me coming into your house and saying, right, this is how your bathroom's going to be, you know, and not really engaging the person, really not getting them really involved. So that was something that was really key to myself and Marnie when we were writing the document, that it was about really giving back control over to the people, for us to think about actually what is our role as occupational therapists in the adaptation process. One of the key things around person-centred care, and one of the things that came out of the DFG review, again, I apologise to anybody that's in Wales and Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, but similar reviews of the major adaptation services in those three nations that come out with the similar things, that people just want the services that will deliver adaptations to come together. So they don't want to be passed from social services to housing. They want those services that come together to achieve the best outcomes around adaptations, to come together to achieve the outcomes that are important to people. And again, in the DFG review, one of the key messages that comes through from the recommendations is about integrating services so that the key people, putting the person at the centre of the process, the key people come together to assess, design and install the adaptation. So I just wanted to put that there just as a reminder. So this is how we've defined the different types of adaptations. I won't kind of read this out verbatim. Not easy to say with a Yorkshire accent. So the way that we've looked at complexity is that we've considered 4 dimensions. So we've thought about the person, so in terms of diagnosis, prognosis, sensory cognitive, motor performance, but we've also considered what their priorities are and what their needs are. So we're not just thinking about diagnosis, we're really thinking about the aspects of person that we think about as occupational therapists. The other dimension of complexity is also the complexity of the activity that the person is wanting or having difficulty performing. So for example, are there lots of carers involved? Are there lots of steps involved in the activity? Does the activity happen in several areas of the home environment? So we've unpicked that when we're looking at complexity. We've then thought about the complexity of the environmental barrier that's causing the issue. So is it a relatively simple barrier? And then we've thought about the type of solution. So is the solution likely to be an off-the-shelf solution? Or is it a solution that's going to have to be very tailored made for that specific individual? What I like about this way of defining an adaptation is that a grab rail, and you will all know this, the occupational therapists that are sat there, you will know that you will have very complex situations where actually the solution is just a grab rail. So I think that this way of looking at and defining adaptation really demonstrates that value, that it's not just about you needing to be an occupational therapist to where a grab rail is, because I don't think you necessarily need to be an occupational therapist, but under certain situations you need that complexity of thinking, that professional reasoning to understand that actually if you put that grab rail 2 centimeters or even a few millimeters not in the right place, that it makes a difference between you providing a sustainable solution or providing an adaptation that doesn't work. So as you can see there, we've got 4 types. So based on those dimensions of complexity, we've got 4 types of adaptations. So we've got simple, requiring off the shelf. We've got a simple situation requiring a standard structural solution, and so on. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense in terms of how we've defined that. And again, that's based on work that Liz Ainsworth and Desley de Jong has done. Just keeping an eye on time. So based on complexity, what we then did was come up with this adaptations without delay framework, and it's just a way of visualizing how we could begin to think of doing things differently. So this idea around you needing more specialist knowledge involvement for those people where the situation is quite complex and where the solution needs to be really personalised. So those are for those adults with really complex, older and disabled adults and children with more complex needs. And this is where we're kind of saying, this is where we're needing the specialist knowledge of occupational therapists within social care and housing to sit. In that darker orange, we're kind of saying this is perhaps where we could look at those more simple, straightforward adaptations where the situation is relatively simple, straightforward, looking at perhaps the trusted assessor role and providing that type of intervention. And then we've got universal, this idea where the solution is kind of off the shelf and the person's got a really good understanding of their needs. So once again, what I really like about this, because we're thinking about complexity, you could have somebody who, to somebody else, it might look really simple because perhaps they've got osteoarthritis, the issue is getting in and out of the bath. But if that person isn't ready to have the home adapted, is really anxious about having the home adapted, that could actually make that case actually needing much more specialist involvement from an occupational therapist who uses their professional reasoning, their therapeutic skills to help that person understand and move forward therapeutically with that person. So hopefully that makes sense. So in the document you will find that we've unpacked universal, targeted and specialist. So you will find in the document what complexity looks like at a universal, targeted, specialist level. Universal, targeted, specialist level. We've then looked at workforce skills. So what are the workforce skills you need for somebody who's going to be working at those 3 levels, and then what are some of the operational considerations that you need to think about if you're going to work differently. So if you aren't necessarily going to have an occupational therapist that has direct oversight or direct face-to-face involvement, then actually what do you need to put in place? And as I say, in the document we've unpacked that in 3 tables that gives you a starting point to look at that. I'm just aware of time, so I'll flick through this. This just gives you an idea of how we've applied the framework and complexity, workforce and operational around some case studies. So this is Rita struggling to get on off the toilet. She's got really good insights as to what she thinks is going to help her, and she contacts a handy person service and to make arrangements to install a grab rail. So what we're saying here is that somebody has to have an understanding of what simple and straightforward looks like, what the different options are to make the adaptation work, the ability to communicate with the service user around where it needs to be fitted. And what's really important throughout all 3 is understanding actually when do you need a much more targeted or specialist service, because I think we all know that we can gather lots of information in that initial triage in first point of contact, although I do think in terms of COVID-19 that is getting better in terms of some of the teleconferencing platforms that clinicians are using. But it's just knowing that actually when you delve a little bit deeper, it's about knowing actually this looks a little bit more complex than initially we thought. And just some of the kind of operational considerations that you'd need to have in place. You need to make sure that your triage tools are really effective, so that you understand that you're signposting or you're putting people through to the right service. System in place, so if you're not having an occupational therapist carrying out the assessment, that you've got the appropriate systems in place to ensure people are working within the scope of practice. You need to ensure that people have had the right training and have got the right competencies in place, and that you've got the procurement and review processes in place as well. A very similar case study for a more targeted intervention. I'll just flick through these, and then something that looks a bit more specialist. I'll get Stuart to hopefully circulate these, or if people want to email me, I can certainly give you these slides if you want to have a look at these in a bit more detail. So that just talks a little bit about kind of the main meat of the document. We've also got service delivery examples. As I say, people are doing these, services are doing these. You are probably have begun to do things differently since COVID-19. And so you're probably implementing some of these changes to your practice. But we have got some service delivery examples. So we've got the DLF. I think we've got Claire in the audience. Claire is part of the team that deliver fantastic training around trusted assessor training. So it talks about their training. We've got examples of how people have looked at delegating responsibility. I'll talk a little bit about the communication design kit in a minute. There is examples of care and repair, thinking Wales, that one-stop shop, because there's some interesting work that happens in Wales. Some of the integrated teams that are out there. So an example we've got there is the Light Bulb project in Leicester, but I know of other examples in Northampton as well, the Heart team there. Some strategic forums that happen around the 4 nations. So that's where we're getting all those different agencies involved, talking together to streamline the process. In terms of guidance, we've got signposting to guidance that talks about layout and space of adaptations, which organisation provides technical expertise. There's some signposting to organisation that provide specialist design guidance for those with sensory and cognitive impairments. I think there's a real gap at the moment in terms of people with challenging behaviour. I would recommend anybody who's thinking about doing things differently to have a look at the Northern Ireland Adaptation Design Communication Toolkit. It's a really useful resource, and it just kind of shows you what can be done when we come together from housing, occupational therapy, and we look at working differently. So I'd strongly recommend you having a look at that document. So just some take-home messages. What we've tried to do with the document is provide you with the resource that starts that conversation around how can we do things differently. So at the end of the day, we get the right people doing the right thing at the right time, so we get the right adaptation installed in a timely way. And again, I think some of the stuff, the innovative work that you're doing out there in health, social care and housing demonstrates what you can do when we need to. So have a think about what you're doing with COVID-19, have a look at the document and see if the document can support you carrying on some of those innovative ways of working, so you continue to reduce the delays in adaptations. One of the key messages that came through the consultation is that there has been a lot of misinterpretation of legislation and the role of the occupational therapists. So we've tried to use the guide to demystify some of that, and that you don't need an occupational therapist for every DFG, but it's understanding when an occupational therapist adds value to the DFG process or the major adaptation process. Yeah, we've tried to really unpick and provide a bit more of an evidence base around the types of situation where we really had value as occupational therapists, and actually where we perhaps get in the way of the process for those more relatively simple cases. Again, it's about making more effective use of our time, and as I say, as we come out of lockdown, as we begin to tackle those waiting lists that have grown since lockdown, that'll become even more important in terms of how we make more effective use of our valuable resource. One of the things we want to really get on is that at the heart of what's really driven myself and Marnie and the team that that have worked on the publication is that it's about prioritising a person-centred approach to adaptations, and where we're thinking about adaptations in terms of actually contributing towards providing much more effective health and social care interventions. So how we can reduce health and social care needs developing through adaptations, rather than installing adaptations when needs have developed. And I think hopefully, as you begin to move forward with new ways of working because of COVID-19, I really do hope that what's in the publication kind of supports new ways of working, taking, really embracing new ways of working, and ensuring that what you're doing is really effective and evidence-based. So just think about, in terms of how you can be using adaptations without delaying COVID-19, with improving what you do at first point of contact, how you're allocating cases, how you're working with colleagues around training and supervision, and how you're collaborating with your colleagues. One of the things that we really want you to do as well going forward is one of the things that we really need to do in housing, and particularly adaptations, we really need to evaluate the impact of what we're doing. So we're needing to look at, measuring the outcomes that we achieve through the work that we do with individuals when we use adaptations to improve health and well-being. So that's the link to the publication. I hope you aren't all fallen asleep with my dulcet Yorkshire accent going off in your ear for the last 40 minutes. And just some useful resources in terms of where you can get the publication, and also the Housing Lane, who led on this project. The Housing Lane has some really good resources around adaptations as well. Marnie Walker, who as I've mentioned a couple of times, she has done an awful lot of work around the resources that are on there for occupational therapy. If you're not already a member of the Royal College of Occupational Therapy Specialist Section for Housing, can I kind of put out a advert for to think about joining that? It's a brilliant resource in terms of supporting you guys out there that use adaptations as an intervention for improving occupational performance and participation. And I think that is it, Stuart. Is there any questions?
There are plenty of questions.
Oh, lovely.
Thankfully, though, we've had quite a few people answer them. So thank you to the people in the chat box helping each other out. Thanks, Dave and Claire, and a couple of the rest of you. Just to clarify, because I think a few people have asked, we've got all your details, so we will email the presentation out.
Yes, brilliant.
In the next couple of days. We'll send the link, and Claire's going to send the DLF level 4 information as well, so we'll send that across.
Thank you, Claire.
Just a couple of questions, Rachel, if I may. Is the waiting list for social care you mentioned related only to the input, or is some of it part of the statutory needs assessment?
Say that again, sorry.
So is the waiting list for social care assessment? So you said the idea is that this speeds up the waiting list for the assessment. Yeah. Is this only related to the input, or is it part of the statutory needs assessment?
It's about what I think. Some colleagues in other areas of health and social care and housing, what they don't realise is that occupational therapists in social care aren't there just to be part of the major adaptations process. And actually, when an occupational therapist goes out and does an assessment, it is about that statutory responsibility that the occupational therapists are fulfilling on behalf of social services around assessing need. Now, obviously, as part of assessing need, we're looking at what solutions that we can provide, and an adaptation might be something that falls out of that, and it might be the DFG that falls out of that. So it's about trying to help our social care and housing colleagues understand that occupational therapists in social care are there primarily fulfilling its duty around the statutory assessment of need and not just the DFG. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what we hope is that by looking at by thinking about complexity, we can perhaps move some of those more simple adaptations where you don't need the expertise and the professional reasoning skills of an occupational therapist through to perhaps housing, or however your organisation decides to do it, which then allows the occupational therapist to actually really do their job effectively, so that they can work with those really complex cases where it's not just about adaptations, but it's about the education, advice, etc., etc. Does that make
Fantastic.
sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Rachel. We've had
All
a
right.
couple of questions where people have asked about, will this be counted, will that be counted as a complex adaptation? So
Yeah.
I'm going to give my interpretation,
Oh,
then
right.
you
Okay.
can tell me if you've got a different one. So
Yeah.
some mentioned, would a ceiling track hoist be counted as a complex adaptation? I think, I've been an occupational therapist 20 years and been in care 24. I think if somebody's got a mobile hoist, the care agency have been going in for a number of years, and it's evident that a ceiling track hoist would meet the need. You don't need an occupational therapist. If the risk assessment's already up to date, the care agency have requested it, and the family think it would be beneficial. It appears on the face of it that you could spec a H-track system without any occupational therapy involvement, as long as you have somebody to do an up-to-date risk assessment. What do you think of that?
I think you're on the right lines. And again, this is where it's not just a case of suddenly one day an organisation saying, right, this is how we're going to do it, we're not going to have any OTs. It's about strategically looking at those types of cases, thinking about, okay, if we're going to do this differently, these are the procedures that we need to have in place. So if it is going to be a ceiling track hoist, or if an OT isn't necessarily going to go out, we must ensure that there has been an appropriate risk assessment, that the staff know how to use the equipment, so that all that is in place. So it could be that actually the OT comes in to do the training, but not necessarily be involved in that front end of the assessment. So it's actually looking at where do you need the expertise of the occupational therapist. So it may be that you need the OT to come in because actually the person has got has got specific needs around how they should be moved and handled. I don't think I'm explaining this very well. So what I'm saying is yes, you are on the right line, Stuart, but it's not just a case of just going in there and changing things. These things have to be unpacked, and it's making sure that that we're not just doing things. We can't make people any less safe than they already are. Do you know what I mean? So it's about making sure that new ways of working are properly supported. One of the things that we hope with the document is that it and I think this is what we found with minor adaptations without delay. Often the content wasn't necessarily used, but just the fact that the document existed enabled people to sit down and actually have conversations about, right, we need to do things differently. How can we do things differently? It's about improving what we're doing. It's about improving the service that we're offering people and not putting additional barriers in the way. Did I explain that very well?
No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because
yeah,
if a care agency or somebody telephone the duty desk and say, we believe we're after a ceiling track hoist, this is the reason why, everything's up to date. What we're saying is, if this is the system and the duty officer says, not a problem, we can sort that for you, do you have the risk assessment? And they say, well, actually, we've been hoisting for a while, we just need the ceiling track hoist, and then we need occupational therapy input. Like you said, you could put the ceiling track hoist in, or the piece of kit, or the safe space.
Yeah.
It's saying you don't need necessarily the occupational therapist or the specialist at the beginning. They can come in the middle or at the end, which is...
Because it's like sometimes the assessment can be actually relatively simple, but actually you need an occupational therapist at the point of actually where you're designing the adaptation. And I think what's really exciting about some of the teleconferencing platforms that are being used is I think we're going to be able to use expertise much more flexibly. So if you've got an OT who's got very, a paediatric OT who's got lots of knowledge, and you're working in the Highlands of Scotland where you're kind of doing lots of generic bits and pieces, at least now we've got that teleconferencing access to be able to kind of, the occupational paediatric OT could be down in London, but teleconferencing into the OT that's working, or the housing colleague that's working in Scotland. So I just think it provides exciting opportunities to work differently. So yeah, so what I'm saying is that you need to have expertise of occupational therapists at different points of the design, the assessment, the design, and sometimes you need them involved in the actual installation, making sure that you've got things, in exactly the right place.
Superb. A couple of questions. One is, if the occupational therapist is deemed as needing to be involved, and they write a specification, is there any guidance about whether, because there's a lot of talk around reasonable and practicable and necessary and appropriate. So if the occupational therapist specifies something, has anything changed to say, well, actually, this should now be provided?
Right. This is almost a separate webinar, Stuart, and I'm more than happy to come on. I think that's that's another debate that needs to happen. I was involved in the DF, again, apologies to our Northern Ireland, Scotland and Welsh colleagues, because I'm obviously referring to the DFG of the English DFG. In terms of, there isn't a lot of guidance around how necessary and appropriate, reasonable and practicable is actually defined. And that is one of the recommendations that I made in the DFG review around, actually, this is what we're needing to define as necessary and appropriate. So I think it's chapter 11 of the DFG review, if you want to read that. And that talks a little bit about how we should be looking at necessary and appropriate. One of the challenges that we have with necessary, appropriate, reasonable and practicable is that sometimes the two things are done separately in some organisations, and actually sometimes you need the OT to go out to do what's necessary. You then need a housing colleague to look at what is practicable in that housing situation. Then you need the OT to take that information to look at, right, okay, what's then appropriate, and then the housing colleague to make a decision around whether that is reasonable. And at the moment, those two, the way that the legislation encourages it to do, the two things are drawn out. The other thing is around how because really our responsibility as an OT is describing what is necessary and appropriate. And for me, that is about saying what space is needing, what features are needed to ensure that person can be independent. I think sometimes when you start specifying particular products, then that's where, it's about specifying what the person's requirements are in terms of the design. So what kind of space do they need? What type of features do they need in that environment? And that type of thing. Sorry, am I waffling, Stuart?
No, that's superb.
Yeah.
Thankfully, the chat box is going a bit crazy, which is great.
Oh, have I said something controversial?
No. I think there's lots of discussions. We're very lucky because we've got some people from Foundations on, and DLF, and a few other people across the country. So there's about 270 people in the talk at the moment, and it's really interesting what people are saying. So
can I just give a shout out to so I would say go have a look at DLF website, go have a look at Foundations, go have a look at our COT website. There's loads of resources out there in terms of working differently, doing things differently at the moment. So I would really encourage colleagues to go out and have a look at bits and pieces.
100%. I was going to say now, we're just at the end now, so I'd just like to say thank you very much for attending.
No, thank you for having me.
It's been superb. We've got lots in the chat box, so we'll pull the chat box out, and if there's anything missing or we've missed something, I'll send it to you and we can send out any questions or answers. This is live on Facebook, so if any of people's colleagues want to have a look, it will be on our Occupational Therapy Adaptations conference page. We'll share it across all our platforms, but it's currently streaming as I speak onto Facebook. If people want to ask anything specific about housing or adaptations, we'll send all the links for our COT specialist section housing, foundations links. There's a DFG Champions good Facebook group, which I suggest people look at and attend. And obviously Claire and the DLF team have got brilliant information. So I'll send all that out to an email to everybody that registered.
There's also Stuart, there's also a really good Facebook page for those who haven't found it, called Home Mods for OT on Facebook. So if you can send that link out, that's a really good resource as well. The DFG Champion Facebook page is really good as well.
Thank you very much. So now we've come to the end of the presentation. I'd just like to say a big thank you again to Rachel Russell for taking some time out of her busy schedule to do the presentation and again provide some brilliant information. So just want to draw it to a close and say thank you everyone for your time. Any questions, please drop me an email, stuart@promoting-independence.co.uk, or just message us on one of our Facebook groups. Take care everybody, and goodbye for now.